Well, I just realized that Easter is rapidly approaching, and here we've been talking about Buddhism for a long time, so I thought maybe we should make a gradual shift from our work with that book on Buddhism by Robert Wright and get into something a little closer to the reason for the season, so to speak. And I realized that I've never talked much about the similarities and differences that we find in the life and teachings of Jesus and the Buddha. So I thought that might be a good segue from one into the other. And I have to start by confessing that over the years that I've been studying world religions, I've never done any in-depth research into the existence of an actual living, breathing, historical person who became the Buddha. I haven't done that in the same way that I have with the historical Jesus. And I think most of you know what my position is on the historical Jesus. If not, here it is in a nutshell. Based simply on the manifest weight of all the evidence that's available, I've concluded that Jesus was a living, breathing human being who worked as an itinerant preacher and an apocalyptic prophet and was executed by the Roman government approximately 30 years before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Now, the evidence is almost entirely circumstantial in nature, but I can tell you from my experience as a trial lawyer for 20 years, you can win cases based on circumstantial evidence. It happens all the time. Now, that does not mean that I believe the gospel stories are factually true. One can accept the existence of Jesus as a living historical figure without having to think that the Gospels were meant to be a documentary. They're not. They're a combination of history and mythology. But today, too many people on both sides of the issue can't seem to separate the myth from the man. For example, one side says that you must believe that Jesus walked on water and was born of a virgin. The other side over here says that you must believe that Jesus never walked anywhere and was never born at all. Those are the extremes. And for the never born at all group, one of the tactics they like to use is they circulate these Facebook posts where they claim that Jesus is just a cheap knockoff of the Egyptian god Horus. And they use other examples, but Horus is one of the more common ones. They claim that Horus was born of a virgin, had 12 disciples, died, rose from the dead, and that means that the Jesus people simply borrowed his story and turned their guy into another Horus. None of that's true. All that stuff about Horus, none of it is true. But it's on Facebook, and so a lot of people believe it. And those arguments, those posts, they are not being made by people who are serious scholars of Egyptology and the history of Egypt. They don't have any original source material, nothing. It's sort of like the National Enquirer School of History. It'll take you 5 minutes to debunk those claims. Now look, I'm not trying to be a Christian apologist here. I say let's have the best evidence, and I mean the best evidence, and then let the chips fall where they may. As I said, I think the weight of the evidence supports the fact that Jesus was a real person, but sometimes I wonder if it really matters, even to the people who claim to be Christians, who use that label. He might as well be a myth based on how a lot of people seem to ignore his core teachings on things like, unconditional love, nonviolence, tolerance, and so on. Mahatma Gandhi was a non-Christian, but I think he hit the nail on the head when he summed up the problem like this. He said, in fact, there is nothing wrong with Christianity. The trouble is with you Christians. You do not begin to live up to your own teachings. And he should know, considering the way that India suffered under the rule of a Christian empire as a colony. But just because people have problems with some Christians who make a mockery of the life and teachings of Jesus doesn't justify sloppy scholarship. and intellectual dishonesty and outright fabrication, like we see with those comparisons to Horus, Osiris, Krishna, and so on. So, with that in mind, I started digging into evidence for the life of the historical Buddha. And you know what I found? There's even less evidence for the Buddha than there is for Jesus. It's still sufficient, but I was surprised to see that there's nobody who seems to be going out of their way to try to convince people that the Buddha never existed or was a ripoff of some preceding figure. And I think I know what the reason is. I think the reason is because Buddhists never took the Buddha's teachings and turned them into the kind of powerful and oppressive institution that Christianity became and that people are still reacting to even today. No wars have been fought in the name of the Buddha. No lands were conquered. Nobody tried to justify slavery and the oppression and subjugation of women using Buddhist scriptures. I'm aware that in recent years there have been some problems in Myanmar where the Buddhists have been persecuting Muslims, but that is a recent aberration. Here's the bottom line, though. Does it really matter if either person never existed? The truth is that the core ideas, the ethical teachings, most certainly do exist. There's no denying that. They had to come from somewhere, from someone, and it's interesting to note that no one else seems to be claiming that they were the authors, that they were the ones who developed and advanced those ideas. So, other than the fact that there doesn't seem to be a lot of hard, direct evidence for their existence, what else might Jesus and the Buddha have in common? Well, for one thing, they both wish that they had been like Muhammad and Moses and imposed a rule that would forbid making images of them. Here's my proof. They're sitting on a cloud talking to each other, and the Buddha says, I should have made one of those nobody can depict me rules. They always make me fat. Isn't it the truth? And Jesus says, tell me about it. I've been a blonde white dude for like 2,000 years. True. Okay, but beyond that, what else might they have in common? Well, it turns out quite a bit, really. One of the things we have to keep in mind, though, is that Jesus was only actively teaching for about 3 years, near as we can tell. The Buddha was active for over 30 years, and the teachings are over 400 years older than Christian teaching, so they've had a lot more time to be refined and developed. Jesus believed that he and his followers were facing the end times. This kingdom of God was going to be imposed on the world, and the forces of evil were going to be eliminated within the lifetime of the people who were listening to him speak. Jesus didn't have a lot of time. So, he would say things like, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the merciful, turn the other cheek, love one another, and things like that, but he didn't have the time to develop a formula or a self-help program to go along with it, to help us to figure out how we should go about those things, some ways of practically applying those ideas in our lives. The Buddha, on the other hand, had ample time. He was able to take his core ethical teachings, and he was able to develop a step-by-step guide. And if you get into Buddhism, you see all these. There's the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the 10 this and the 15 that. I mean, it's very detailed. He was giving us a step-by-step guide for how to be more compassionate and how to live a happier life. Or at least a life that isn't driven by attachment or by this insatiable desire and clinging that we have that causes so much suffering for us. That's why I think it makes sense to study both. I think it makes sense to study both. If someone is inspired by the moral and ethical teachings of Jesus and his life example and wants to remain culturally Christian, you can still celebrate Christmas and Easter and everything else, you can do that and apply Buddhist ideas about the human condition and the practices that we can implement to try to deal with the human condition. So I want to mention a couple of well-known authors who have written books on the subject of Jesus and the Buddha. The first here is a Buddhist teacher I know you're probably familiar with, Thich Nhat Hanh. He's written 2 books, one called Living Buddha, Living Christ, and the other one is called Going Home, Jesus and the Buddha as Brothers. And it's interesting to note that the foreword to Living Buddha, Living Christ was written by Elaine Pagels, who is a professor of religion and actually an expert on early Christianity. So there's that cooperation going on there. And on the Christian side of the aisle, we have the late Marcus Borg, one of my favorite authors, who was a professor of religion and culture at Oregon State, and he was actually one of the founding members of the Jesus Seminar. His book is Jesus and Buddha, The Parallel Sayings, and that book has a foreword written by Buddhist scholar Jack Kornfield. So one of the things that is immediately apparent, if you don't know anything else about Jesus and the Buddha, we know that they were wisdom teachers who were essentially homeless. They lived in a state of voluntary poverty. They basically owned nothing beyond their sandals and their robes. That was by choice. Jesus would, for instance, he would say to people if they wanted to become a disciple, sell everything, sell it all, give the proceeds to the poor. And the Buddha had similar requirements for those who wanted to be part of his monastic community, his followers. This is a saying that comes from the Dhammapada, which is one of the best known Buddhist scriptures, and the Buddha is reported as saying, "I've got children, I've got wealth. This is the way a fool brings suffering on himself. He does not even own himself, so how can he have children or wealth? Surely the path that leads to worldly gain is one, and the path that leads to nirvana is another. Understanding this, the disciple of the Buddha should not rejoice in worldly favors, but cultivate detachment." We live in a consumer culture. Conspicuous consumption is actively promoted all around us, so this is a tough sell. But nobody is saying that everyone should live according to the rules for monks and disciples. What we see in our culture, though, is certainly excessive, and both of these teachers had some very clear and uncompromising ideas about materialism and how it gets in the way of spiritual growth. So at the very least, we might consider a call for moderation. The Buddha is offering a call for moderation, or the middle way. The same thing with Jesus. We don't have to give up everything, and we don't have to measure our lives by money and possessions. That would be a good starting point. Another common teaching we find is the golden rule, of course. Jesus said, "Do to others as you would have them do to you." The Buddha said it even more succinctly. He said, "Consider others as yourself." Well, that's another example of collective wisdom that we really seem to be having a hard time applying. It's been around all these years, but we're still not quite getting it. Another core idea that we find in both traditions is nonviolence. Jesus said, "If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also," among other sayings. The Buddha said, "If anyone should give you a blow with his hand, with a stick, or with a knife, you should abandon any desires and utter no evil words." The Buddhists managed to stay nonviolent, at least until the recent problems in Myanmar that I mentioned earlier. Christianity is a different subject. Under the influence of the Roman Empire, Christianity became insanely violent, which is a trend that I'm happy to say that we might see starting to reverse, thanks in large part to the work of Dr. Martin Luther King and, actually, the Catholic Church, which has been a strong and consistent voice for peace and nonviolence since World War II. Maybe we're starting to get it. Maybe. Now, both Jesus and the Buddha talked about the problem of becoming attached to an egotistical notion of self. Jesus said this. He said, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it." The Buddha said, "With the relinquishing of all thought and egotism, the enlightened one is liberated through not clinging." Now, I could go on with many others, but I think we have time for about one more. And this one really gets us into unity territory. Both traditions talk about how most of our problems are really due to having an undisciplined mind. That's where it all starts, from the inside. In Matthew, Jesus said this, "It's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you. You are defiled by the words that come out of your mouth. The words you speak come from the heart. That's what defiles you. For from the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, all sexual immorality, theft, lying, and slander. These are what defile you." Jesus diagnosed the problem, and the Buddha offered a solution. The Buddha said, "The mind is difficult to control. Swiftly and lightly it moves and lands wherever it pleases. It is good to tame the mind, for a well-tamed mind brings happiness." And I can't resist dropping in this quote from a few weeks ago by Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore, writing in his book, Keep It True Lent. He simply said, "The greatest need of the human family is thought control." One final point in closing. I'm not saying that Jesus and the Buddha taught the same thing. That's another oversimplification that makes its way around Facebook from time to time. But there are similarities. And those similarities, I think, are compelling evidence that the human mind seems to be instinctively drawn to and arrive at certain core ideas that have been proven through the course of history to be beneficial and advantageous when it comes to human happiness and human flourishing. And I think the message is really simple. When we find those kind of ideas, we'd best pay attention. See you next week. Thank you. Thank you.